people didn't know if they were going to, if the Taliban was coming to their house, what really that meant for them. So I think once a lot of that initial fear subsided, and the America finally left, and people sort of started to try to normalize the best they can. And certainly every day, people are approaching me, begging me for help in trying to get out and wanting to be evacuated. But for the most part, a lot of Afghans who are still here realize that that opportunity just sort of isn't there for them. And this is a new world that they're going to have to navigate as best they can. And so sort of day by day, you're seeing more shops open, traffic's getting thicker, people just learning to adapt. And Afghans are extremely resilient people, and they've never really seen any peace in the last 40 years. Even before the United States came in, there was a series of perpetual conflicts. So for them, it's sort of this new phase, in a way, is even bringing a little bit of stability temporarily to them. But their biggest sort of concern now, I guess, is being able to put food on the table, and the economic crisis that is something that's really needs to be addressed.
So in the streets of Afghanistan, is there any tension, or is that kind of faded away ever since the takeover?
I think people are really, for the most part, I know in the news we sort of see a lot of this hysteria, I always may say, and definitely not to take away from that, because there are people that are certainly frightened. But I would argue, if I wasn't here, I would probably think that the entire Kabul was sort of blowing up in some degree. But really, that the incidences that we see of targeting or people being hunted down, they're really the exception, not the rule. For the most part, there is actually quite a bit more stability in the country now, for lack of a better word, and that is in large part because the Taliban were the ones that were waging wars and setting off car bombs, and they're the ones that were sort of perpetuating a lot of the attacks. And now that they're in power, they don't have the need to perpetuate this attack. So there is sort of a strange, it's almost safer now, or definitely is safer for me to walk down the street now than it was when I was covering Afghanistan previously. And crime has fallen really dramatically. So there's this, I guess, a fear perhaps, and people are very aware that the Taliban will dish out very harsh and very fast punishment for any crime or violations. So I think that fear is instilled in people that they kind of have to toe the line. So it's certainly a much more muted vibe than it used to be. And Kabul especially is a very vibrant place. And right now it doesn't have that same sort of energy it had before. But having said that, it's busy, and people are sort of just figuring that they need to get back to business.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. You mentioned it a bit earlier, but on the topic of the public perception of the Taliban, have you noticed a big generational difference between those who lived under the past Taliban rule and those who were born in the past 20 years who have never seen the Taliban?
Ironically, I'm actually probably seeing more fear come from the younger generation of people who perhaps were very young or not born when the Taliban ruled previously. And, I think that's just a sense of the fear of the unknown as well. I guess people that have experienced it, obviously they're scared and deeply concerned about it, but they also, in a way, recognize that maybe they survived it, and so have learned to navigate it. And the Taliban of today is certainly trying to portray a very different image than the Taliban did 20 years ago. So I'm actually seeing probably a lot more of the hysteria and fear come from the younger generation who really haven't known a life that wasn't under the US occupation. So for them, they were sort of born into, I guess, an artificial economy where things seemed probably a lot better than it was because the US was pumping a lot of money into the country. There were a lot of programs and different opportunities for people to sort of learn and grow. And so people really got used to that, and used to that almost despite the war and the instability. They got used to the money and the opportunities that having a foreign force provided. And now that that's sort of been ripped away, and I call it a band-aid over a bullet wound. So it's really the US being there was never fixing the country, so to speak, but in some ways it was holding the government together. And now that that's gone, I think it's very much the younger people who just don't know what to expect, and the uncertainty has induced a lot of fear.
Yeah. So just for a bit of context about what these people are experiencing, what are the main differences between this iteration of the Taliban and the Taliban that the world saw 20 years ago?
I think, the Taliban is definitely on a PR spin right now, and they're trying to portray themselves as being significantly less harsh and much more welcoming. They've said that they've offered a general amnesty, meaning that they're not going to retaliate against anybody, although we've certainly seen them go against that in individual circumstances. But I think the Taliban really realized during their last reign that they were very much blacklisted from the international community, that they were never going to be recognized, they were never going to receive the funding or the legitimacy. And I think what the Taliban really craves is this international legitimacy. They want to be seen at the United Nations. They want to be at the table with foreign governments. And that's something they were never able to really do previously. So I think right now, a lot of their goals is centered around, obtaining that legitimacy is something they really want. And they do understand that there are certain obligations that they have to be part of that. And so they're also in this very challenging position right now, where they have to try to appeal to the international community, but they also can't be seen to cower to what the US is telling them to do or what Europe is telling them to do, because that will, essentially, they've indoctrinated, hundreds of thousands of these young soldiers to really follow in their very draconian interpretation of Islamic law. And if they are seen to be, coddling or cowering to what the international community wants, they see that as foreign invaded, and they have to weigh up the risk of these Taliban fighters joining an even worse group like ISIS. So they're having to play a very difficult balancing game.
Yeah, so I'm getting a few comments in the chat asking about if we could just delve a bit more into how Afghani women have responded to the Taliban takeover.
Yeah, and I'll just say one caveat here. We always say Afghan. Afghani is the currency. So just. Most people don't know that, but yeah, no, I just think it's a good little thing to know. So Afghan. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
How are Afghan women responding to the recent Taliban takeover?
It's been really a difficult situation, and certainly women are, they stand to lose the most. And, that is particularly in Kabul. And, women who've been able to, especially in the city like Kabul, have been able to work and gain access to a full education. And, there's been music institutes, which are obviously now closed, and just really opportunities that were never open to them before. And I think women, for the most part, are just really terrified. I certainly understand that a lot of the women's secondary education for girls has not gone back, and the Taliban is using this sort of excuse that they have to be able to provide individual transport for girls to be able to go to school so that they don't interact with boys. A lot of the schools are already segregated, so I think a lot of it's kind of just the Taliban are looking for excuses and trying to use that as leverage to get their funds unfrozen. But it's certainly, women have a lot to lose, and most of them are still, at home in their basements and trying to leave or trying to navigate this new world. But I also will say that we tend to, in the media, really only view Afghan women from the lens of Kabul. And the lens of Kabul is extremely different to the lives of women in rural communities. So I definitely try to go out and talk to as many women in a lot of the villages and faraway provinces. And to be quite frank with you, the women in those places, their lives are not going to change any significantly. They're already deeply conservative societies. And women there, in some ways may actually benefit from the Taliban. And I say that because their lives won't change in terms of how they dress, or they don't necessarily go to school or work. So their lives are very much relegated to being at home. So I think for them, what we're going to see is actually more stability, because they don't have to worry about the level of attacks or air raids or bombs that they previously had to worry about. So I always try to sort of caveat that it's important to not see the Afghan women in a monolith, that that the city life is extremely different to women in rural areas.
So straight after the takeover, we saw a bunch of protest actions from women in Kabul. So what would be some of the punishment, or how would the Taliban respond to such protest actions and women speaking out on the recent takeover?
Yeah, and that was I remember I was sort of caught in the middle of that, and we were I was at the emergency hospital, which is in the middle of Kabul, when one of the protests broke out, and you just sort of heard, a huge amount of gunfire, and that was the Taliban shooting not at people but in the air. So they, again, this is a new world. They did not know how to respond to that. They did not know, a lot of them had never seen a woman before. They would probably have only ever seen their wife or sister and mother, and really had spent the better part of the last 20 years fighting in the mountains. So to kind of see this women protesting in the street, or anyone sort of going against their rule, was something that they just did not know how to deal with at the same time. So I think initially their responses were very brutal sort of crackdowns. And the protests have waned a little bit since then, but I think the Taliban, what it does is tries to sort of squash these things out as quickly as possible. And I think that's because they really haven't, this is such a foreign concept to them, the idea of sort of people protesting their rights, and most of all women protesting their rights. So I think at this point, for what I've heard from women, it's really, there isn't, they maybe sort of get roughed up a little bit. Some may have got detained, but I don't think that anybody was sort of dished out any harsh punishment or kept in jail for any significant period of time.
Yes, and on that topic, has there been any structural barriers to overcome in your own reporting in Afghanistan as a female journalist?
It's been a real sort of challenge, I guess, dealing with the Taliban. And I say challenge not in that I have problems and I interact with them daily, but I think it was very sort of strange initially. I go into a room, I'm usually with my photographer, Jake, and what we call a fixer. So when I work in foreign countries, you usually have a local person who helps you arrange meetings, who sort of acts a little bit like a producer, I guess, to coordinate timing for things and help us develop the stories that we need. So I'm going into these interviews with Jake in the weed, and I'm completely invisible. The Taliban does very guttural introductions and welcoming to the men, and I am basically, not looked at, not seen, not heard. Although they obviously, I'm the one doing the interview, so they are listening to me and responding to my questions. And but their sort of protocol is that they won't look at me. And so I've eventually, especially sort of that first month, maybe I found, so 6 weeks, I found it. I sort of, I guess, accepted it on a cultural level. And then I just, I had to take a step back and wonder what role I could play as a foreign journalist. I didn't want to be part of the problem in normalizing this behavior. I really felt that women had come too far in the sense, and that the Taliban also really needed to realize that we're here, we're going to be working, and this is, seeing a woman is just something that they're going to have to get used to. So I sort of made the decision to be a lot more in their face. So over the last couple of weeks, I pretty much just stare them down until, even if they're looking at me, I just sit there and I stare at them until, and I would say 90% of the time they actually break and end up looking at me. So I sort of see that as my own little moral victory. And so, and even in the street, I will go and interact with them, when possible. And even though they pretty much don't want me there, they're generally forced to have to kind of deal with me. So I just think it's important not to normalize being invisible. And so with being respectful at the same time, I am just trying to make them aware that this is something that they're going to have to get used to.
Yeah, and given you face such significant challenges as a female in this space, what has it been like for female Afghan journalists, public personalities, or commentators during this period?
Most of them, and sadly, have left. And I say sadly, and I'm glad they're safe and they're out in other countries. But a lot of the people that were really the foundations to the media here and foundations to the art world, they all were very quick to leave. So there really isn't There are certainly Afghan journalists left, but a lot of some of the major personalities have definitely left. There are women that are still incredibly brave. There's a 24-hour cable news channel here called Tolo, and there are women out there still trying to do their job, still in the streets, still, again, like the rest of us, navigating this new world. But it's certainly, for women, it's a very, very intimidating experience for local women to sort of have to talk to these Taliban who see them in a very different light to what they've been sort of grown up and been able to understand. So it's a sad, and I have a good friend of mine who lives in Jalalabad, which is a city in Nangarhar province close to the Pakistan border, and she, for the past, really since the takeover, so that would be 2 months, has just, she's terrified, and she hasn't been able to come out. She hasn't been able to go to work, and every day she just says, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I think, that's a position that a lot of young, especially women journalists, are in.
Yeah, it is such a shame that they feel that they can't be comfortable in that space. How are Afghan women, planning to live their lives under a Taliban rule? Is there a groundswell of anti-Taliban sentiment amongst women in Afghanistan?
Yeah, definitely. I think for the most part, women, they don't want to be, they don't want to live under this sort of rule that's very stringent in that sense, and that they can't sort of, even interact in an office space with a male colleague. So it's certainly going to change, and life is difficult for them. Right now, Afghanistan is sort of in this holding pattern. So things, I still wear what I wore before when I go out. I still basically do the things that I did under the previous government, and that is because the laws haven't changed yet. So the Taliban is still trying to form its government, and that could take months, years, weeks, we just don't know. And so until that full government is formed, they will not sort of form what is called a jirga. And a jirga is a group of Islamic scholars that come together and they decide what the laws are going to be. So they decide what women can wear, or how long a man's beard needs to be, or just all those basic laws, or what punishments are going to be doled out. So that hasn't happened yet. It's very unclear when that will happen. I'm constantly asking, and I just sort of get this response that, it's going to happen very soon, but there really isn't a timeline to that. So until that happens, until these laws are kind of set in stone, we just really don't know. So things are sort of going along as normal, and that is because the Taliban hasn't come up with its legal code yet. So when that happens, that's really going to be a significant indicator into what direction the Taliban is going to take with the country, and it's going to show really just how different, if at all, that they are to their previous rule in the 90s.
Yeah, it will definitely be interesting. I'd also like to delve a bit deeper into what it's like for you as a journalist in Afghanistan. I wonder if you might talk us through how effective your press card actually is in granting you press freedom in Afghanistan. We know that recently the Taliban held you for questioning in a police station. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so for the most part, so the protocol with journalists is we have to go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Taliban there, gives us a letter that basically is supposed to allow us access to wherever we want. However, there's still a really complex web of communication that needs to go on. So if I'm going to a different province, I'm told that I need to get permission from the cultural director, who needs to give permission from a local commander, for me to access a road. So it's this sort of terrible song and dance, and almost every day, no matter where I go, I will be out somewhere, and even if I have all the full permissions that have been secured, inevitably, a Taliban convoy of fighters will come along and yell at me and ask me why I'm there and who I'm there and why I have permission to be there. So it's just something I've had to learn to navigate right now. But for the most part, yeah, so that particular experience was a few weeks ago. I was in Kandahar, which is a province. It's sort of the birthplace of the Taliban. So it's sort of where Mullah Omar back in 1994 founded this movement out of a tiny mosque. But we went to Spin Boldak, which is a Pakistani border town. And the border was shut because the Pakistan side had decided to shut it. And most people there are they're used to crossing back and forth on a daily basis. And most people there had wanted to, usually going there to see family, they're going there for urgent medical care, or they're going there for trade. And all of that had been very abruptly shut. And so that had created a lot of tensions. And I guess when we sort of sought our permissions to be there, we weren't informed that there was some fighting happening there. And so it was essentially, quote unquote, a military zone. So what happened is my photographer and I sort of went out into this incredibly busy border area just to interview people, to sort of find out what they were doing, why they were stuck behind, and their frustrations. And whenever people sort of see a foreign, I guess, journalist or you just attract this giant mob. So I would be trying to talk to somebody and I would just turn around and there would just be 100 men closing in on me behind me. So and it's never a comfortable situation to be in, and we kept trying to move around, and this just kept happening. And the Taliban were just sort of literally flogging people for mobbing us. And, I was feeling terrible about it, and I didn't want anyone getting hurt because of me. So I just said, we needed to go. And we'd obviously attracted the attention of a lot of Taliban just by nature of the mob being there. And then we sort of tried to get our driver, and he had not been where he was supposed to be, and we couldn't reach him by phone. And so in the end, the Taliban has told me I had to get into their police vehicle. So I got in, and they took myself and my photographer to the police station and held us there. And I really thought that it was going to get resolved really quickly. I wasn't worried at all, and certainly is not, I've been in these situations before, and they weren't a reason for me to panic or anything. But what happened was, we're waiting for hours, and I'm giving them all my documents, my passport, my stamp, my press card, my letter from Mujahid's office, and they just looked at me and said, "This is all fake, you're a spy." And that's something that journalists we always deal with, and especially in trying to work in the Middle East or a lot of these countries, there are a lot of conspiracies that all journalists are spies, and that obviously ratchets up the danger of the profession, because you don't have any other recourse other than to say, "But I'm not." So it just sort of took, and meanwhile, all these different people are sort of coming into the room, and Taliban intelligence people, and just different levels of people that are all trying to question me and question my photographer. And so I wasn't really too worried about it, other than when I saw my fixer, Naweed, starting to get worried. That's when I was sort of, a little bit like, well, what are we going to do here? But luckily, because all our documentation was above board, I am in the country legally, and so once they were able to reach Mujahid, who's the Taliban spokesperson, reach his office, and they were able to verify who we were and that we had, permission to be in the country, then we were let go, and ended up getting extra access than we wouldn't have got previously, because they were so apologetic about the situation. But yeah, it's certainly an uncomfortable situation, but not one that you can really sort of panic about, but one that you just have to navigate through. And that's that's kind of what we did.
Yeah, all the experiences you've had, they're so awe-inspiring. So you were in Mazar-i-Sharif when it fell. For those who don't know, Mazar-i-Sharif is a major city in northern Afghanistan, which was a stronghold of Taliban resistance and the first place liberated from Taliban rule in late 2001. Can you tell us what it was like to be in Mazar-i-Sharif as it fell, and did you fear your safety at that point?
Yeah, so that was an incredibly unique experience. So I was working in Kabul, and I had decided to go to Mazar-i-Sharif, which was sort of a stronghold, and to someone I'd met, and I did a profile with for several years earlier while I was in Turkey. And this is sort of an old warlord by the name of General Dostum. I don't know if anyone's seen the movie 13 Strong, but that is based on General Dostum, who was a very controversial warlord who the US was the first person the US came in with when they invaded Afghanistan to take the Taliban out of power. So I'd known the general for a while, and I was going to go back there because he had all these forces that were working with the Afghan army to repel the Taliban, and it was supposed to be this story looking at these incredible, what they called public uprising forces that were resisting the Taliban. So I went to Mazar with my photographer, and it was so crazy how quickly this happened. So I think, we got there, it was really early on a Thursday morning, and Mazar is a city that I absolutely love, and it's just full of life. And so we were sort of walking around, and the markets were open, and there were just sort of people everywhere. And there's a beautiful blue mosque there, and sort of went there, and life was just, it was hard for me to imagine that so many of the northern provinces around Mazar had recently fallen, and that the conflict at that point was maybe probably 30 to 50 kilometers away, but there was no sign of that at all in Mazar. And every person that I talked to from the Taliban, not the Taliban, the NDS, but National Directorate of Security, which were the Afghan intelligence branch, and then just local commanders were, Mazar will absolutely not fall. It's you've got Dostum's forces, you've got them working with the Afghan army. They're not going to see this. The Taliban is not going to take this place anytime soon. And so I really wasn't sort of concerned. And so that was the Thursday, and life was, everything was full of life. And then sort of Friday came, and you noticed there was some sort of shift. And I was talking to people, and everybody kept sort of saying, they're going to come here eventually. We're trying to get to Kabul. And even at that point, I couldn't really see it. I found that that assessment to be a little bit jarring. And then Saturday came, and that's when you just saw this complete shift. And I'd gone out the night before with some of the Afghan forces, and they were supposed to call me again that morning, and I didn't hear from them. And I went out to the streets, and it was just, you saw people lining up around the bank, just trying to get all their money out so that they could flee, and just the shops were closed, and it was just an incredibly eerie feeling. And I was trying to call interpreters of mine that I knew to come and work with me. They'd all just left. They'd all gone to Kabul. They'd all fled. So ended up a friend of a friend came to help us sort of navigate the day. And it was just, by the hour, it got more bizarre. And you started to see people from the outside villages just fleeing on foot into the city, because the Taliban had taken over those areas where they were living on the outside, and just these people just coming in. And we eventually got in a cab and wanting to sort of drive out toward some of these front lines. And we're driving, you just sort of seeing again people in abandoned stores, and the interpreter was on the phone, and then suddenly the cab driver just stopped and looked at me, and he said, "I'm scared, I don't want to go any further." And so of course, I was like, "Oh, absolutely not, I don't want you to be scared, we'll go back." And my interpreter looked at me, and he said, there's three lines, three front lines essentially. And he's like, the first one's just fallen, and the second one's about to fall. And they were surrounded the city. And even then it was just, and I was calling people going, is this going to be okay? I mean, there's no way I can get out between now and then, what do I do? And everyone said, no, you're going to be fine. I said, my flight's not for two days back to Kabul. And they said, no, it's going to be fine. And so the day went on, we ended up going out to this restaurant, this kebab cafe that we always go to, my photographer and I, and we went there, and suddenly, the TV was turned off, and there was just nobody there. And we just looked at each other and went, something's wrong, we need to go back. And so we sort of started running back to the hotel we were staying at, and you just sort of saw motorcycles coming into the city, and then that was the Taliban. And so literally the second I made it back into my hotel, that's sort of when the Taliban just came in and took complete control, and we were stuck in a very precarious situation. We did not know how the Taliban was going to respond to a foreigner, to a journalist, to a woman. It was just all these unknowns. And so that was it was probably one of the first times I've actually felt very terrified, and that had to navigate. And I wasn't in Kabul, so the journalists and things that were in Kabul at that point, they had the airport and the evacuations that were starting, and there was sort of a recourse to get out. But for us, we were pretty much probably the only foreigners inside Mazar at that point. And I'm calling people in the State Department in the US, and calling contacts that I had at the Pentagon, and they were just like, we don't know how you're going to get out of it. So that was certainly an unpleasant feeling. But here I am, so we worked it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you kind of mentioned earlier that since the fall, the Taliban has kind of been on a PR spin for legitimacy. For many of us in Australia, especially those among us who have Afghan friends and those who remember the Taliban of the 90s, I don't remember, I wasn't born, but there is a significant degree of skepticism about how truthful they're being in their promise to respect the rights of women and minorities. Can we or should we trust what the Taliban is telling the international community?
I certainly, I definitely take a lot of what they say with skepticism for sure, and a grain of salt, because they really need to show by their actions. And I tell them that all the time, and they sort of look at me and they go, well, why won't anybody trust us? Can't they see that we're different? We're not going house to house shooting every person. And I remind them, you waged a very, very brutal insurgency for 20 years. You detonated suicide vets. You shot at Americans, Australians, police forces. You're a part to play in this, and people are not going to forgive you overnight. You need to prove by your actions, not what you say. And so I do think that is going to sort of take some time. But I caveat that with, I think there's an extreme amount of resistance, obviously because the Taliban is as brutal as what it is. And so there obviously is a very sort of knee-jerk and fear to in any way recognize them. And I certainly understand that. And I agree with that, but I think sometimes we've got to step back and look at the big picture. And the big picture is there really isn't any other option right now. So the longer that sort of the Afghan people are in a situation where there is a humanitarian crisis, where there is a huge economic crisis, the Afghan people are the ones that are going to suffer from that, not the Taliban, it's the regular people. So I just think we have to weigh up what the options are in a situation like this. And there really isn't any. I don't see another country coming in. I don't see, an armed resistance, taking the Taliban out of power. So we have to look at, well, what are the options here? And really take into account, maybe we have to figure out what these options are with the Taliban, because I certainly don't want to see another war here. And I don't see any other option. If you don't want the Taliban, you're going to be looking at another armed conflict. And that's not something that I want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's less of a question of whether we can trust the Taliban and more that we don't have a choice.
Right, definitely. But with that comes leverage. And that's where the diplomacy comes in. And that's where I think people in the US are a little bit frustrated, because they would have liked to see the US use a lot more of its leverage as a world power to sort of dangle that carrot a little bit, to compel the Taliban to comply with a lot of things we view, especially in the West, as important, such as human rights. And so there are certain leverages and diplomacy that can be used to sort of pull them into line in some way. So it's certainly not just about letting them run free and do whatever they want. I think it's about trying to find, just try to hold them accountable to their actions, and use, I guess, that the foreign funding and the aid as a way to show them that they have to abide by certain, international norms to be able to access that.
Yeah. All right. Wow. We are so incredibly grateful to have been able to share your insights today. It's been so eye-opening. I had a great time personally. I think we're going to open to audience questions. So I will hand over to Mr. Fallon.
Thanks, Rosie. And thanks so much to Jenna, Rosie and Jeremy for your insightful questions. For the audience's interest, Jenna, Rosie and Jeremy came up with all of those questions themselves, which is just fantastic.
Great question.
Yeah, I know, aren't they wonderful? So I'd like to jump to a few audience questions. And of course, if you haven't asked a question yet through the chat, feel free to send them in, and I'll see how far we can get with as many as possible. We won't be able to get through every question, but I'll try and synthesize a few as well. I'd like to actually start with one that relates to your most recent book, which is a book that explores ISIS from a really sort of human perspective. And it's a really fantastic and quite an innovative text, actually. I think if anyone's interested in that part of our modern history, but also interested in kind of the social perspective from someone who's been living there for such a long time, I think that it's a wonderful insight. Now, Of course, during the writing of that book, you actually worked quite closely along, with members of ISIS and interviewed a number of them. And we know that, of course, in Afghanistan, there's been a number of sort of attacks perpetrated by ISIS. And the US government officials have come out recently and of course, linked those to the Taliban in various ways, suggesting perhaps that the Taliban and ISIS are in constant communication. Could you actually maybe give us a bit of maybe a bit more insight into the reality of that relationship between the two groups and whether, is ISIS gaining a foothold, or is that really the truth? What's going on the ground?
So I definitely think, there is a tendency, and I see that a lot in the media, to try to conflate the Taliban and ISIS as being one of the same or sort of working together. And I certainly disagree with that assessment very wholeheartedly. I'm sure there are probably insider, molds and communication in that way. But for the most part, the Taliban is very much at war with ISIS. And from everything that I've seen, the coordination, if any coordination is happening, it's on very individual sort of levels of people being paid off, etc. And it's certainly not on a large scale at all. And in fact, they've had very bitter conflicts and continuing to have bitter conflicts. The ISIS threat, depending on who you talk to, I think is significant. The ISIS doesn't control any territory, and it doesn't have a huge amount of members, I don't think. Probably hundreds, maybe maximum 1,000, and they're sort of scattered around sort of the Nangarhar, again, so that Pakistani border area. They don't control any territory, so they don't have any sort of official government structure. But what they can do is they can wreak havoc in the sense of planned attacks, suicide bombs, as sort of their modus operandi. So they're sort of doing, and the purpose of doing that would really be to undermine the Taliban government and try to show that the Taliban government is not capable of providing stability and security to the Afghan people, very much like what the Taliban really did to the previous Afghan government. So in some ways, they're sort of getting their own back in that way. But I'm careful not to overblow the threat of ISIS. I think we tend to sort of look at ISIS as being, perhaps a lot, more prolific or stronger than it really is. It's important to remember that the ISIS in the Khorasan, which is the affiliate here in Afghanistan, is very different to the ISIS that we saw in Iraq and Syria, even though they pledged the allegiance to the same leader, Baghdadi, but they're very different. And really, it was formed here, again, it was a splinter Taliban group. So it's important to keep in mind that, it was leaders within this Taliban that decided that they weren't getting enough power, or that they wanted sort of a different interpretation of the law, and so they splintered off and created this group. So I certainly, and it's something I'm investigating a lot more, and next week plan to go to Jalalabad and a few of these places to sort of see what the situation is there. And I certainly think it's a threat that needs to be looked at, but I don't sort of see it as, that there's no way that ISIS is going to take over the Kabul government anytime soon. They just don't have the sort of the physical strength or numbers for that. But having said that, they can certainly wreak havoc with their attacks and suicide bombings and things. So I think that's something the Taliban is incredibly worried about. You see that a couple of days ago, the US issued an alert for the Serena Hotel in Kabul, which is sort of the one very nice hotel that is here, where a lot of the UN or a lot of the foreign journalists will often stay when they're here for short periods. And they issued an alert basically saying that everybody needed to stay away from the Serena Hotel, that there was an imminent sort of ISIS threat there. And I drove past there yesterday, and you can just sort of see that the Taliban has just deployed hundreds of people to the hotel because they are so worried about their own security being undermined. But it's sort of ironic in some ways, because the Taliban itself has attacked the Serena Hotel multiple times in the last 20 years. So, you're sort of seeing this very bizarre situation now of all these blown up roads and blown up places, and now the Taliban is protecting them, and it's sort of looking at them thinking, you blew that up, and now you're the one that has to pay to repair it and also safeguard it. So it's just very strange twist of events.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, the parallels between how the Taliban were sort of perceived under the previous government of Afghanistan, and now how that interplay between them and ISIS is actually working. There is a strange irony to that, and how quickly the mantle passes as well. It's sort of following from that and going a little bit further into maybe some of the work you did in relation to Iraq. We do have a question from Chris asking perhaps whether you have any contact still with the Kurdish people or Yazidis, or even journalists that you actually interacted with in Iraq, and what is their circumstance at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I still very much stay in contact with friends there, and somewhere I'm hoping to get back to soon. Life there is certainly tough, and Iraq has always been a very difficult place to work, and again, from an economic point of view. So the Kurds especially, they're still fighting for their independence, and I'm sure going to be fighting for that for a long time. It's sort of, unfortunately, a lot of the same internal rivalry and fighting that happens between the Baghdad government and then the Erbil government, which is the Kurdish government. And so they're really dealing with that, and also just sort of this economic crisis. And I think what happens when we see conflict is, when it is headline news, when it is something like ISIS in Iraq, or if it's in Afghanistan, there's a sort of swell of international attention and donor support. And then once it leaves the headlines, suddenly the NGOs are not getting the donor money anymore. The UN's not getting the donor money. And so the situation almost becomes worse in that aftermath period. So you sort of still see a lot of the people that were never able to go back to their homes. They're still living in camps with tents that haven't been replaced for many, many years, and they just don't have anywhere to go, and there is no money for them at all. There was more money coming in, obviously, at the height of the conflict than there is now. So the aftermath in the years later, and when things are forgotten, is almost more difficult for people, because they have no access to resources or medical care or the health care that they need, and yet nobody's sort of giving them any of the media attention. So it's always a really sad predicament. Even years later, a lot of these camps are still open.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. And I suppose I'd like to move now to some questions from a number of people who have relationships to Australian armed forces who actually served in Afghanistan. Of course, a number of us do have friends or family who served over in Afghanistan. It was such a long period of time that we were engaged there. One of the questions that I thought was quite interesting was whether you, what you might actually say to, an armed sort of ex-serviceman or a veteran who has returned to Australia and feels a sense of maybe loss or shame that it appears that nothing has changed, and that really the time invested was wasted time. I know you touched on that earlier, but how would you sort of suggest to them, what can be taken from the war in Afghanistan?
You can, for example, you can drive around Kabul or a lot of the areas, and you can see, it's a very different city here that exists than what existed 20 years ago. There's certainly been a lot of development, and a lot of things have come from that that can be looked at as, mild successes that have happened. A lot, even in the diaspora, the people that have left, they've been afforded an education, and women have been, given sort of unprecedented access to careers that they would never have had before. Even if they're not in the country anymore, they can still take those skills to wherever they end up. So, I always try to sort of preface, I guess, with the positive side of it, but I think it's also important to be realistic in, looking at, really, obviously, for the money, and more important than the money is, the people that have lost their lives, both being Western or NATO forces, as well as just hundreds of thousands of Afghan people that have lost their lives in this war. And it's hard for me to look at that and in any way see that it was worth it. And I think we need to be very frank in our assessment with that, and our assessment in learning the lessons from that, so that we don't make those mistakes going forward. But again, having said that too, it's, everything comes in ebbs and flows in life. And so, the only way that we can really look at that and take a step back is that time was done, that era was over. And at the end of the day, the Taliban has come back to power, does that mean that we wanted the Taliban to be in power for the last 20 years? No, I think that, you know, people were sort of saw this freedom and they saw a very different light than they would never have been exposed to, you know, had the Taliban has been able to continue to hold the country and the US never coming in. But I do really think it's important just to look at the war and really understand that the human cost probably wasn't worth it.
And we do have also just a couple of questions. We've touched on some of this before, but just a little bit more focus on perhaps how you feel currently in terms of your personal safety, and maybe also give us a sense of how you felt when you had to leave. And I know that you have a number of friends, close friends in Afghanistan, and that would have been quite confronting to do so. Could you give us a bit of insight into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the most part, I'm not, you know, deeply concerned with my personal safety. I certainly go out every day and do my job as best I can. And I'm not worried, you know, from the Taliban point of view. I guess you always have to worry about, you know, ISIS attacks or other sort of crime, although crime's really gone down, but you know, you always be very aware of those things. But at the same time, I have a job to do and I'm there to do it. So I really am not too worried about my personal safety in that sense. Yeah, the Taliban I'm not concerned with now that I've become a little bit more familiar with them and they've become a little bit more familiar with me, so to speak. And so I have learned to navigate that. Leaving was really difficult. It wasn't actually, I wanted to get out of the situation that I was in and being trapped in the city, but I wasn't, you know, I knew that I didn't necessarily want to leave and just to go back to that. So being in Mazar several days, trying to get out, you know, the only thing that we really realized that we could do was to essentially just to talk to the Taliban and let them know, you know, we were here and, you know, we needed to sort of get out. At that point, you know, if I'd had the choice to have gone back to Kabul, I would have probably taken it. But at that point, that really wasn't an option. And the closest way to get out was to go to Uzbekistan. So once I think, you know, I'd coordinated with, you know, someone in the United States, the United States government had someone from the embassy in Tashkent in Uzbekistan had sort of helped facilitate through a local partner. And anyway, we were able to sort of get out and, you know, talk to the Taliban, and very much to our surprise, you know, they were being extremely friendly and welcoming, and they have a concept here called Pashtun-Wali, which is where they have to look at anyone who's a guest in their country. It has to come primarily first, and they have to be welcomed. And it's also Pashtun-Wali that essentially caused the war in a way, because Mullah Omar, who founded the Taliban, was obviously providing haven to Osama bin Laden. And the US said to him, well, you need to give up Osama or we're coming in. And Mullah Omar, because of the Pashtun-Wali code of a guest being in the country and them having to be prioritized, said, we're not giving him up. So that's when the US came in. So sort of interesting there. But so we ended up talking to the Taliban, and you know, they were certainly not hostile at that point, and they gave us, you know, escort and things to get to the Uzbekistan border. And yeah, we really didn't want to leave, but I think in the back of our mind, my photographer and I were always planning to come back. But I stayed a little bit longer in Uzbekistan, and that was more out of respect to one of the sort of the high level contacts that I had in the US State Department. That was the embassy who sort of arranged it. And when I went to his house for dinner, he sort of said to me, you know, I've been doing diplomacy for 30 years, and I've, you know, been in every country from Libya to Iraq to, you know, all these places, and had to greenlight many things. He said, but I was, you know, I'd never been more terrified than when I basically authorized you to drive around with the Taliban to the border. So, you know, I recognized that he had taken, you know, a huge risk as a career diplomat to allow me to sort of, you know, get in a car with the Taliban and have them take me places. And so out of respect to him, I sort of wanted to leave it a little bit and not go immediately sort of straight back. But once I felt that I navigated the situation, and I did work there, and then also in Tajikistan, and then when I felt that it was sort of the right time to go back in, that's when we did. So that was sort of about just over a week later.
Yeah, that's amazing. Just the fascinating kind of nuances of all the diplomatic and cultural interactions that you have to navigate. We are coming to the end of our time, and I don't want to go for too much longer, but I want to ask one further question that I think is a really interesting one from one of our students at the college, which is, how much do we really think that the Taliban want or need international recognition, but also sort of a corollary to that is thinking as an international community, what levers can we pull to bring the Taliban into line to ensure that to ensure that Afghan rights and the citizens' rights are upheld and that the promises are fulfilled?
Right. So Taliban certainly are very much vying for this, international legitimacy. The line that all of them use is, "We want good relations with everyone." That's sort of what they say on a diplomatic level, and they very much want to be seen that. And that was something that they could not achieve in their previous rule. But there, as I said earlier, it's a very difficult situation for them to be in because they can't be seen to be, cowering to anything that the US or international community wants from them. But at the same time, the US community is not going to unfreeze the aid or offer any really sort of humanitarian assistance until it can see that things like girls are able to go back to school, or that human rights are being upheld to some degree. So again, it really comes down to what is going to happen when they solidify their law, when they are able to form a government. And the Taliban promised that they were going to have this very inclusive government. But, as you can see, it's not inclusive at all. There are no minorities, there are no women. It's very much their hardliners that are all vying for power right now. So I think the levers that the US really, the only levers the US can really pull at this point is the sort of the financial ones and that is something that the Afghans really need. And that's the way that the US is going to have to sort of navigate this situation. But we can also use, there are certainly countries that have already formal diplomatic ties with the Taliban that still have their embassies open. China, Russia, Pakistan, Uzbekistan. So I think, the US, for whatever relationships that it has, and I know with a lot of those countries it's a little bit terse, but we can also use some of those countries that have slightly closer relations than, say, the US or Australia has to sort of get them to toe the line too. But I think from an aesthetic point of view, the Taliban has to be seen by its people as being extremely independent. So it's a lot of it's just kind of a smoke and mirrors game that is going to have to be played.
Yeah, and I suppose we also, as you mentioned earlier, we hope that the levers that are pulled are, in line with smart sanctions, and that we're not seeing that the actual Afghan people suffer as a result of that. Just to end, I just want to thank you so much for your time. For those who aren't aware, you're actually up incredibly early this morning. So you started with us at 1:30 and you've come through to just after 3 a.m. So you poor thing, you're going to have to go and have a nap afterwards. So I just want to really say a massive thank you from the whole college community, but also the broader Sydney community and those joining us from around Australia. It's been wonderful to hear from you in such depth. There's been a number of messages to me during the chat and also on my phone, just saying how much admiration people have for what you're doing and for, particularly for the human insight that you're giving us in Australia. For those of you who aren't aware, Hollie has a number of she has a podcast and also frequently publishes online as well. You can follow her via her website, and also you can, of course, purchase her book. And the final question I'd like to ask you, Hollie, from our much loved head of dance, Norman Hall, when are you returning to?
Norman. Hi, Norman.
So when are you returning to Australia, Hollie? When can we see you?
I hope soon. I wanted to come back last year and also early this year, but obviously with the COVID travel restrictions and the difficulties there, I just sort of decided it would be best to kind of wait for that to kind of normalize, hopefully in some way. So I'm hoping that will be soon, and I'll be able to. It's been a long time since I've been back. So all my family is still there in Sydney. So I really, got nieces that I haven't met yet. So I really hopefully will get back probably early next year, if things go to plan. That's my goal. So yeah. But I really want to say, you know, it's been a long time since I was at school, but you know, I always credit people when people ask me, especially about growing up and you know how I guess got started. I definitely credit my time at the McDonald College, and it was an incredibly unique, you know, way to go to high school, and really just the people that were there, and just it was very much an environment where people really supported each other, and especially when you're in those very difficult, you know, teenage years, it's very unique to have that. And so that's something that, you know, I really treasure and value about my time there. And people, you know, also ask me, you know, how do you sort of go from this dance background into being a war reporter? And I always say that dance taught me everything I know about being a war reporter. It teaches you a discipline, it teaches you a focus, it teaches you to be incredibly resilient in difficult situations. But, you know, really for me too, it really opened my eyes to music and to places and to people around the world that I would never have really known, or, you know, Alvin Ailey and Yuri Killian and all these, you know, fantastic choreographers that I just, you know, that really opened my mind to significant markers in history. And, you know, living, you know, growing up in a country town, that probably wasn't something I was ever going to be exposed to. And it was really that piqued my curiosity for wanting to understand the world in a deeper way. So I'm very, very grateful to the college for that.
Yeah, and we to you as well. It is a real wonderful thing to work at such a wonderful place, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the performing arts is boundless in terms of the gifts that it gives you, and it goes well beyond, of course, the arts and well into the academic. So, and I suppose that's what we are as a college. We're very much a college that tries to, you know, bring those two things together and support our students in that way. So yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and thank you so much to Hollie and to all of those in the background who've made today possible. Thank you so much, and we'll see you later.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hollie.
Thank you.